Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And he's going to bring us up to date on the really important stories, that the information you're not going to get from the controlled media. And ladies and gentlemen, the media in America is largely controlled. Our minds are molded, our ideas suggested, our taste formed largely by men and forces we don't even understand. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan. Hope all is well with you.
All's doing well, and tell us what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, let's first take up the dramatic news of yesterday's announcement by President Barack Obama when he went before the nation in a nationally televised press conference to announce proof that he was born in Hawaii, supposedly putting to rest 2.5 years of controversy over conspiracy claims that he was born in Kenya and not eligible to be president. Well, as Obama proudly displayed a photographic image of his Hawaiian birth certificate, the ear-to-ear smirk on his face should have tipped off the viewers that they were observing a not-so-carefully crafted hoax. In fact, even a cursory analysis by amateur Photoshop users shows that this was a computer-generated image with several alterations. Worse, the various layers of the document were still visible when downloaded and opened in Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. The forgers at the White House had forgotten to flatten the image, which means to merge all the layers of the creation into a single layer before publishing it, allowing the fraud to be easily viewed and dissected. Well, the White House has got to be scrambling now that even professional Photoshop experts agree that the document was Photoshopped. Instead of diffusing the birther movement, it's bound to grow even larger. So far, however, the press is absolutely in lockstep in presenting the view that the controversy is over. Even the intellectually challenged billionaire and would-be President Donald Trump was snookered by the fraud, or he may even have been a part of it. He loudly crowed in one national interview after another how proud he was of himself for having forced the president to finally show his birth certificate. Well, Trump must know by now that he was had, and will have trouble coming back before the public and claiming that he was tricked now that the evidence of fraud is out. Most likely, Trump will continue down the path of compliance with the official story. Some have even wondered if Trump was part of the setup to get this issue back before the public and then, quote, resolved. If Trump does not backtrack and get back on the birther attack, I'm convinced he was part of the fraud, whose intent was to raise the issue again only to have it debunked by the White House forged document. So let's review the evidence that this document was a computer-generated fraud. First of all, the electronic image displayed by the White House still has separate layers present. A simple, unaltered scan of a true document would not have more than one layer. Number two, the green safety paper imprint on the background is more distinct outside the text area than inside. That is strong evidence that the text box was on a separate layer and implanted over the safety paper layer, making the underlying layer of safety paper slightly less distinct than the text, and you can see it if you look. It's very easily visible. Number three, there's no chromatic aberrations around the letter edges as there are with a scanned document, as this claims to be. Here's what that means by chromatic aberrations. When you zoom in electronically on any scanned document, you get slight color separations at each side of a letter, a blue U on one side and a slightly pinkish U on another, that's visible under high magnification. And this was not present, and it's a proof of computer generation. The White House document shows the document in a binder, which explains the increased shading on one edge as the bound volume is opened and pressed against the
Hold that thought, hold the thought. This is Dr. Stan, and Joel is simply pointing out that if you look and you know how to analyze this birth certificate, there are a number of layers to it. When you get a birth certificate, it's not in layers. It's simply one sheet of paper with the information on it, but this is obviously a compilation of several layers to give the impression that this is Barack Obama's birth certificate, rather than a compilation of other information which is put together to try to put to rest this idea that Barack Obama is not an American citizen or a natural-born American citizen, and therefore not entitled to be the President of the United States. Certainly this issue has been addressed recently by Donald Trump. Whether he has been a shill or not, we don't know. We do know that Dr. Jerome Corsi is coming out with a carefully analyzed book, and it will be available within about 2 or 3 weeks. And of course, Dr. Corsi, I'm sure, has done an excellent job on this. Maybe this is simply to diffuse the issue, but if Barack Obama has had his birth certificate all this time, why did they simply release a certificate of live birth rather than the birth certificate? And of course, why would they put together something with anybody who knows anything at all about fraud and about certainly counterfeiting would recognize that this is not one layer, but a number of layers, and you can actually separate the layers. And Joel actually has, on his World Affairs Brief, links to videos where they will show you how to separate one layer after another. How many layers are there in this this counterfeit?
There are 8 different layers, Dan. 8 different layers.
Okay, you go right ahead. I can't believe that they could do such a bad job unintentionally.
Well, it's actually a very good job if they had not forgotten to merge the layers, what's called flatten the Photoshop, into one image, because when you can pick it apart, you can see exactly how the forgery was occurred and what parts were forged. I mean, it's incredible, Stan, about how the media is trying to scramble now to explain away, and it's a very poor job. They've got a couple of people out there shilling for the government. One named Joe Brooks of Wire Update says, oh, it was just someone at the White House trying to take a negative, which he's referring to a photostatic copy, which is what it used to be the first form of copying that was developed in 1907, where they could take a negative photograph so it would come out. And you've seen birth certificates that have this white printing on black background instead of black on white, and that's a photostat copy. And he says some of the White House took it upon themselves to doctor it up so that it can be readable. Well, it doesn't take 8 layers and forging and changing certain dates of things to doctor it up to make it reasonable. I mean, this is just a blatant excuse to make this thing go away. Even the supposedly conservative National Review, created by globalist Skull and Bones member William F. Buckley, is working to create false excuses for the alterations. Nathan Goulding, writing for National Review, tells everybody how they can open the House-released PDF in Illustrator and it will break out into layers. He says, I've confirmed that scanning an image created or converting it to a PDF and optimizing that PDF and then opening it up in Illustrator does in fact create layers similar to what is seen in the birth certificate. So what he's giving the impression is that the Illustrator software is the one that creates the layers. And it's absolutely false, Stan. You can take any PDF, and yes, it will throw up empty layers, but those layers don't have anything in them, and it cannot create the kinds of layers that you see here. I mean, this is absolutely disingenuous for anyone claiming to be a conservative and throwing up these kinds of excuses to explain away what I've described in the layers. And as I said, you have to see these videos with someone using Photoshop to take them apart and turn them off and on to see how dramatic the forgery has occurred. And there literally is no way to explain it if you're actually looking at the turning it off and on of layers. But now I'm going to discuss something that is probably unique to the World Affairs Brief. I've been saying this for months, and it has not caught on within the birther movement for some reason, and part of the reason is Jerome Corsi. Now, although I'm a big fan of a lot of Jerome Corsi's work, he has made one major error in all of his research, and his entire book is based upon it, and that error is going to cost him and the entire birth movement success in challenging this birth statement, and this is the issue. In order to make this fraud work, the media had to alter the description of the two types of birth certificates produced in Hawaii and indicate falsely that one is a short form of another longer form. Now, you've heard that before. In fact, I even heard you repeat it to me, Stan, is that this birth certificate is considered to be the long form, and that the certification of live birth that he presented months prior in the campaign was what? A short form. This is absolutely false, and this is crucial to understanding something. Even Jerome Corsi, as I said, of WorldNet Daily, who has led the charge against Obama's origin, fell for this false idea and kept repeating it column after column, that the certification, and I want to have your listeners be very careful to what I say. We're talking certification of live birth versus certificate of live birth. Let me describe the two. Certificate of live birth is what they're referring to now as the long form birth certificate. I don't like long form and short form because it's part of this disinformation propaganda. I'll explain. Certificate of live birth is a hospital doctor-generated birth certificate. Certification of live birth is not. It's a totally separate kind of birth certificate, and it's only used when someone has a birth outside of a hospital without a doctor to sign the certificate. So they get a certification because it isn't a certificate by a doctor. It's merely a parent certifying. So this is the important thing. The certification form has never been a short form of anything. It is not connected in any way to a certificate of live birth. That is a hospital-generated birth certificate.
Well, it sounds to me like you would never get both. I mean, you'd either have a hospital-generated one or you'd have one generated by your parents. You would not have both.
So you can see, Stan, how it's essential that they put this disinformation out there to connect, because Obama started out with the certification of live birth, and now is moving to the so-called long form, which that's the disinformation claiming that it's related to the certification, that somehow a certification of live birth has behind it some long form that was hospital generated, and this is absolutely false. And Jerome Corsi fell for it. Every one of the proponents of the law, the legal court cases against Obama have used it and said, basically, we demand to see the long form. The point is, if you've got a certification of live birth, there is no long form, never will be, because it's either one or the other. They are mutually exclusive. Nobody can have both. The certification form is not a certification of a long form birth certificate. It's a certification of birth outside of the hospital system, so nobody can have both. If anybody has both, as Obama is claiming now, it is proof that one or the other is a fraud. Now, that's dramatic evidence, Dan.
All right, point well made. Go ahead. I certainly would concur with you. Go ahead.
Ignorance of this issue, as I said, has caused many conservatives to walk away and say, well, I guess I was wrong. It doesn't help that, researchers like Mr. Corsi should know better and don't address it. What about that pesky notice of the newspaper announcing his birth several days later? TV commentator Anderson Cooper has been at the forefront of attacking those who challenge Obama's birth in Hawaii. In discussing the birth announcements in the Honolulu Advertiser, he kept on going about how only hospitals or the birth or office of birth registrations can generate those notices in the newspaper. Now, that is absolutely false, even though he kept repeating it over and over again. There are hundreds of babies born to Hawaiian midwives, and Hawaii is very sensitive about making sure that Native Hawaiians have every right to send notices directly to the newspaper when they're not born on it. So this is absolutely false, that newspapers only accept birth announcements from hospitals or the office of registry. And conveniently, the doctor who supposedly has his signature on this has been dead for 8 years. But it wasn't hard for the media to get his wife to agree that the signature was her husband's. It would be hard for any layperson to detect an electronic copy of an original signature because it's a copy of something real. And the family was so ecstatic about the notoriety of their husband and father supposedly delivering a president, they failed to conceive that they were being used. Of course, none of this newfound transparency by Obama answers why he spent, as you pointed out, over $2 million in legal fees to keep from revealing a hospital-generated birth certificate if it existed all the time. It just doesn't make sense. Of course, none of this newfound, or now that the birth certificate has been forged, the White House now will have to invent hospital records for Stanley Durham, who never was a patient at Kapiolani Hospital in 1961. Now that Obama has appeared to be open about his birth, he should have no issue with allowing the hospital to release this record if they exist, but I'll bet the hospital will continue to refuse because, in fact, they don't exist. I'm not holding my breath about any of Obama's school records either. There's a lot to keep hidden, and any number of records would reveal not only his longtime foreign status as a student, but questions about grades and advancement to Harvard's law review without so much as a published article on law ever surfacing. You know, you can't find an editor of a law review who hasn't been well published because that's how they get the editor's job.
Well, obviously there has been a force behind Barack Obama for many decades preparing him for the presidency. And I think this is what people have to understand, is that he didn't suddenly just appear on the scene. This is long-term planning. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I agree. This has been a long time coming, even though Barack Obama surfaced fairly recently, within the past 8 years or so as a state senator, then immediately getting elected to the Senate and to the presidency, which was a very fast rise. But I believe that he really was working for the CIA. He got recruited while he was at Occidental College, and that his tenure at Columbia University was only a front for his service during the CIA.
And we actually have an article written by Corinne McLaughlin, comes from the Lucis Trust, who said that members of the New Age, the occult, had been praying for years that Barack Obama would become the next president of the United States. What a coincidence.
British gave him information.
Hold that thought. Hold that
23
thought.
people.
Joel is talking about certainly the WikiLeaks, and certainly there's a gentleman who was accused of bombing a church in Pakistan. Turned out he was working for one of the intelligence agencies. He was arrested, taken to Guantanamo, and then, of course, he provides evidence against how many of the other prisoners there?
23 prisoners.
All right, fine. But this guy had been working for our own intelligence agencies, and the question is, we know that many of the people who are responsible for some of the real violence were actually working for our own intelligence agencies. Why would we be employing people who would be blowing up things and killing people? Go right ahead, Joel.
The bigger question is, as a practical matter, how would you remember details about 123 people unless you are a mastermind yourself over, the point is these people came from all different parts of many, many different countries and battles and things. There's no way that this al-Qaeda operative, if he, working for MI6, would in fact know this wide range of disparate, or even remember that. I mean, this is obviously a person who was being used by MI6 to simply indict these people. The MI6 was providing him the information, and then he was providing the testimony, and it was considered, even by many of the American interrogators, to be unreliable. And this is the stuff that's being withheld from the American people. Well, Spencer Ackerman also detailed this week how U.S. doctors at Guantanamo were complicit in covering up for torture and abuse at the prison. They explained away the bone fractures as falls, didn't ask what caused the lacerations and bleeding, called the hallucinations routine, and rather than blowing the whistle, medical professionals entrusted with the care of detainees at Guantanamo Bay regularly turned a blind eye whenever there were clear indications of abuse and torture. That's according to a newly published report from two physicians with unprecedented access to the medical records of 9 Guantanamo detainees. They were writing in the Journal of Medicine, Physicians for Human Rights, in any case, this is just shameful. And there's one more case of collusion that even shows up in the WikiLeaks thing. The former Afghan cleric and politician who spent 6 years at Guantanamo Bay after being detained for links with al-Qaeda. And the Taliban in 2002 was also working for British diplomats and possible intelligence services at the time of his arrest. This is Mullah Haji Rohala Wakil from the eastern Kumar province, was held by American forces in August 2002. It came as a shock to British and European officials in Kabul at the time who were in contact with him and were actively working with him. Well, Ruhollah had fought against al-Qaeda and Taliban forces during the campaign of late 2001 alongside American troops, and officials have told The Guardian was seen as playing a key role in maintaining stability in the northeastern part of Afghanistan. The Americans, however, believed he was running drugs, well, so were all the others working with the Americans, and was working to destabilize the Afghanistan government at the time and had a role in plots to assassinate senior government figures. I mean, you can't be working with both those sides for or against Americans, unless, in fact, you were one of the controlled terrorists that the Americans were sending in to destabilize and playing a role. And what happens is, of course, you have lower-level intelligence figures that end up arresting this guy, and then they have to be bailed out by the other side who knows that, hey, he's one of our guys, but he's out there acting as an agent provocateur. This is exactly what happens when two British agents dressed in mufti, civilian Arab attire, got arrested in one of the southern Iraqi battles with explosives. They were dressed up as Arabs and had to be rescued by the British when they were caught by Iraqi forces.
Now, what you're really talking about is British military people who are pretending to be Arabs, or pretending to carry out terrorist acts of violence, against the British forces, whereas actually they were actually British agents. It's exactly as certainly Great Britain and their intelligence agencies have financed and had their people working in the Irish Republican Army that was coming over and blowing up buses and killing people in England. And the people who are doing it were working for the intelligence agencies. They create the best enemies money could buy, and they create these terrorists. So much of what this terrorist movement is actually generated by our own or British intelligence. Go ahead.
In fact, the two that were captured were not pretending to be terrorists. I mean, they were actually on a mission to use those explosives to create damage. And so they were first captured by mistake and had to be bailed out by the British.
As I remember, they put them in jail. The British actually used a tank to break down the walls of the jail to get their people out. These people had actually been killing people, and they were working for the British, pretending to be, Arabs. Go right ahead.
That's right. That's right. Well, as I pointed out before in the brief, British, Canadian, and U.S. intelligence are running their own set of agent provocateurs in terror, and that al-Qaeda at the top is a U.S.-run terrorist operation. Why?
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Get back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is Joel Skousen, and Joel is simply making the point that so much of the terrorist activity is actually being generated by our own intelligence agencies. If you look here in the United States and in Great Britain, almost all of these incidents where people have been arrested have been uncovered because they were incited by agent provocateurs who encouraged the violence, who provided the explosives, and they found susceptible, foolish Muslims who are willing to go along with this after being pushed and prodded into carrying out acts of terrorism in the name of, of course, loyalty to the jihad and the Muslim cause. So basically, it is the technique that's been used for thousands of years, whether it be Machiavelli's The Prince talking about how you had to generate an enemy. Certainly in 1984, you had to generate an enemy. We know that Lord James, a member of the House of Lords, testified before the House of Lords on the 1st of November of last year how he was funneling money to the terrorists in Ireland and in North Africa from the Bank of England. And you could doubt that. You can go up on the internet and just type in your search engine, Lord James, Belfast Telegraph, finance terrorists, or we can provide you with a text from the House of Lords. We actually have the text is available and exactly what was said. Pick up the story there, Joe. Before we do, though, I want you to tell our listeners how they can subscribe or get a copy to your publication and how they can get your books, and we'll go on from there.
Well, thanks, Dan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. And as I mentioned earlier, people can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. There is a modest subscription price, for the World Affairs Brief to support my work, and thousands of people have subscribed to it and get a weekly briefing, such as what we're talking about today. Also on my website, one can find out about some of the books that I've written about preparedness and security. I'm a high security consultant as well as the publisher of the World Affairs Brief. I've written 3 books on the subject. The top seller is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. It's just come out in the new 3rd edition, all color maps and a whole new section on foreign retreats, as well as how to do contingency planning within the United States and where safe areas are and what the various threats. We do a lot of threat analysis in the book. My biggest work is the 700-page Secure Home. It's a book, everything from A to Z on high security construction and self-sufficiency. The 3rd book is How to Implement a High Security Shelter in the Home. That's about its architectural plan book on how to do a safe room within an existing basement. And all 3 of these are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927 in Joel's books, certainly Strategic Relocation, The Secure Home, and the other one are among our best sellers here. So remember, if you'd like to get them, 1-800-544-8927, and you pick up the story there, Joel.
Well, my prediction that the U.S. is still planning for and intending to put ground troops in Libya is strengthened by the NATO calls for military advisors to be inserted. Remember Vietnam? It started out with advisors. Next, arch-globalist mastermind Henry Kissinger made a call this week for an invasion force of U.S. ground troops to be assembled for Libya. Of course, he surely must know that the U.S. 2nd Marine Division is already at the ready for such a call. In Yemen, protesters are still angry despite the deal forced upon them. Protests. There are many angry protests over President Saleh's immunity deal to stand down. Patrick Cockburn of the UK Independent reports that the plan is the latest attempt to defuse the crisis over the future of Mr. Saleh, who has been in the office for 32 years, drawn up by the Gulf Cooperation Council. This is a group of Arab leaders still under the West's control, of which Yemen is not a member, and it proposes that Saleh hand over power to his vice president a month after an agreement is signed by the opposition. The rival parties would then join a national unity government in the next week. In return, Mr. Saleh, his family, and aides would be granted absolute immunity from prosecution. This is one thing that Hosni Mubarak did not get when he was ousted by the West, and now they are bringing out the prosecution charges for him. Mr. Saleh is guilty of much more, and he's being given immunity. Well, at least 130 protesters have been killed so far by security forces who went after them at the orders of Mr. Saleh. So what a deal. Immunity was the key issue. Saleh gets off scot-free, and his lackey vice president rules in his stead till new elections can be held. And believe me, the opposition is no better than Saleh was. Well, Syria's President Assad is taking cues from Bahrain's ruthless suppression of dissent, the help of Saudi troops, and hoping to do the same. You notice that we didn't come out and really attack Bahrain for the deaths that they've caused against Shiites. And I think the reason is we're talking about the Saudi role. And, the Saudis are a reliable ally of the United States, and so the U.S. couldn't very well criticize Saudi Arabia for helping in the persecution of Shiites in Bahrain, but that's the issue. And I think there's an attempt here to provoke Iran into more intervention in these various uprisings in support of the Shiites. By association, of course, the U.S. is on the wrong side of history in Bahrain, and more importantly with Riyadh. Saudi repression of the Shia in Bahrain is more about repression of its own Shia eastern province where there's oil than about the specter of Iran meddling. Indeed, the aggressive Saudi game plan legitimizes Iran's regional hegemonic aspirations. What that means, and that was a quote from Hossein Askari, is that Iran had no choice but to stand up for Shia rights if it wants to play a regional role now and in the future. The Saudi misstep in supporting Bahrain in its open suppression of the Shia opposition affords Iran the perfect invitation to take on a more assertive, overtly militaristic role than in the past. What sense of justice could allow Saudi Arabia to enter into Bahrain with force to kill peaceful Shia protesters and rob them of their basic human rights, but outlaw Iran coming to the defense of the oppressed. What he's saying, of course, is that much of this result might be engendered with the purpose of provoking Iran into an overt role of intervention, which the U.S. could then use as an excuse to attack Iran. Meanwhile, over 300 protesters have now died in Syria, and international pressure and condemnation upon Assad has reached a point where Assad's days are numbered. Although Russia and China both resisted a UN Security Council resolution condemning Syria, and it failed, both communist nations have a lot invested in Syria and aren't going to give up control easily. Well, 233 regional Syrian leaders of the Ba'ath Party have quit the party as certain Syrians began to position themselves for what they suspect is the inevitable fall of Assad. But many more are hanging on, knowing that their entire career is linked to the Ba'ath Party, that there is no other path to them, for them to reconcile with the opposition in a post-Assad world. And the U.S. is working, of course, to control the fledgling opposition. Well, overall, the Arab revolt, and specifically Syria's chances of beating that are very slim. The Syrian army is moving to crush in blood, said Patrick Cockburn, the protesters calling for democracy and the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad and his regime. Unburied bodies even lie in the streets of Daraa, the city in the south, which is in the center of the popular revolt. Will it succeed? Well, the chances, he says, look fairly even right now, with almost everything depending on whether or not demonstrators will continue to march or rally despite being shot at. And I think that's, a real question of whether or not they can continue. It's only, of course, that they have it being told or whispered to by Western intelligence that we'll be there to back you as soon as a few more of you die, that they would continue to do so. Nobody's really stupid. With the uprising against police states, both Republican and monarchical in the Arab world, is entering its fifth month now, says Cockburn, without a decisive victory on either the powers that be or the protesters. In Tunisia and Egypt, the political and military elite felt that if they got rid of their geriatric leaders along with their families and cronies, they might prevent radical change, but that remains to be seen. We still don't know what kind of government is going to end up in Tunisia and Egypt. In Bahrain, the monarchy, aided by Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni Gulf states, destroyed the pro-democracy movement and is terrorizing its supporters. And so it failed in Bahrain, and of course the U.S. let that fail. Syria is going down the same road as Bahrain. At the end of the last week, President Assad and his inner circle appeared to have decided that such limited concessions as they're willing to make for reforms would only be interpreted as weakness, so they've decided to shoot it out with them, just like they did in Bahrain. They don't realize, however, that the U.S. is in favor of Bahrain, but not Syria. And repression may work for the short term, but the government does have a core support based on the Alawite minority, which is who the Assad family, top military and political leaders all belong to, that particular minority group. But they're also facing Druze minorities and other Christian minorities who really doubt the claims that the opposition is non-sectarian. Either way, the Christians and Druze will lose in this battle. Overall, however, the police states in the Arab world, which have seemed so immovable for the past 35 years, are now seeing themselves under a concerted attack, and that's because they're getting money from the underground through intelligence operatives of the U.S. and Britain. But they are fighting to survive. I'm not in favor of them. There were some coup d'etats in 1975, but these were stopped by ferocious multi-layer security agencies that turned military dictatorships into police states, and they were also helped out by Eastern European intelligence agencies in those days that controlled most of these Arab states. Now it's the globalists that control them, and we're getting a different brand of insurgency, but I'm fearful that this will end up in the hands of radical Muslims.
I agree with you. I share that concern. Go right ahead.
Well, one of the biggest stories is that Hamas and Fatah have cut a deal in the Palestinian territories. After a decade of stalemated negotiations with the quartet of four globalist superpowers, U.S., EU, UN, and Russia, and Israel, Hamas has finally cut a deal with Fatah in a bold move to create the impression of a unity government. So there's no more unity than before Hamas ousted Fatah from the Gaza Strip. But both see this move as their only hope of getting the world to recognize a Palestinian state. That state with political sovereignty will provide the shield Hamas is looking for to import new weapons necessary to mount an effective war with Israel. The world is a fool to think that there ever will be peace in Israel, especially in trading land for peace, in a unified Palestinian state to provide some shield of national sovereignty. With the facade of one Palestine, Hamas is ready to make its appeal to the UN to unilaterally recognize this state. So I think, Stan, we're going to see a dramatic change now because the negotiations, of course, have been going nowhere. They can't go anywhere. The two sides are intractable. But now I think we're going to see the UN have the excuse to intervene with a united Palestine calling for recognition as a Palestinian state. In Israel, this move is seen as fomenting another surge of support for globalist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Haaretz comments that the Palestinian reconciliation deal, if realized, heralds the takeover of the Palestinian national movement by Hamas. This is not going to be a shared political arrangement. Hamas will rule, providing Prime Minister Netanyahu with an escape from the rut he has fallen into because of the deadlock of the peace process. Hamas, or Haaretz, which is kind of a center-left newspaper in Israel, says this is just what Netanyahu needs to unite the Israeli public behind him and thwart international pressure to withdraw from the West Bank. Well, yes, it may stall any direct pressure for negotiations of more land concessions, but the threat of a Palestinian state makes those calls for more concessions moot. In other words, you get a Palestinian state, you get the whole West Bank anyway, without having to negotiate with Israel. As for Netanyahu, the Palestinian reconciliation deal justifies his warning that any territory vacated by Israel will fall into Hamas' hands and become an Iranian terror base. Well, that's right. Blame it on Iran. That's a true sign that Netanyahu is a globalist because every other word out of his mouth is Iran. Only two options remain: that Israel surrender to the expected UN resolution on Palestinian independence and agree to withdraw to the Green Line. The Green Line basically puts Israel as a state about 15 miles wide, 35 miles long, and entrench itself in its current position. Well, the retrenchment strategy is absolutely unsustainable militarily, especially when the Golan Heights is seated in the deal. As I've long stated, the Golan Heights is the high ground overlooking the Jordan Valley. I have long said the combination of the U.S.-provoked Arab revolt and the resulting unrest will eventually feed power to radical Muslim elements that will present a wall of hostility towards Israel, and that will guarantee another Middle East war, most likely provoked by the U.S. and initiated by an Israeli preemptive strike. Iran will be drawn in, and all hell will break loose as American troops are still camped out in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's the reason the U.S. keeps refusing to withdraw, because they want them there to draw us into this larger Middle East war.
Once again, I fear you're right. And basically, Obama promised to get our troops out of Iraq. Well, he said, I pulled them all the combat troops are out. We just left 50,000 troops there. 50,000 troops? Yeah, but they're not combat troops. And we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, and we're going to get our troops out of there, a lot of them this year. And anybody who thinks that has to be incredibly naive not to understand there's a much bigger picture. But go right ahead, Joel.
Absolutely true. If you see all the weapons they have and 50,000 troops remain, you know very well that they're combat troops. And those four major super military bases there are not about to be abandoned to the Iraqis. Well, whenever the next subject is the globalist puppets on tour, whenever Jimmy Carter is trotted out to instigate another peace initiative, you know the globalist appeasement side is at work. And whenever John McCain goes on tour, you can be sure there's a warmongering agenda on the march. And both were busy this week. John McCain has a long history of engaging in grandstanding as policymaking. He does this in both domestic policy and foreign policy debate. On most issues, he does not so much have an informed opinion as moralistic and ideological reactions that are shaped and channeled according to what gain him the greatest attention. That's what Daniel Larson says. My comment is he does everything on direction of others. McCain himself doesn't have an original bone in his body. He's a true puppet of the establishment. Like most other, quote, centrists, which are actually liberal rhino Republicans, they're praised for their independence and their bold truth-telling. But it's fact, it's a facade. Just like he was carrying water for the establishment, attacking torture. He, in fact, was only setting up the Republicans to give in to torture when he assented to the government bill, which in fact gave the president special powers and exceptions to the very law that McCain was promoting.
Well, I think that McCain, of course, is a very dangerous man. He betrayed his fellow prisoners when he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and of course, basically they have him. He was involved in all sorts of activities over there. They provided women for them. He made certainly publicity statements for the Viet Cong, totally certainly suppressed here in the United States. I'm sure they have them. I'm sure they could use them. They use that as a means of controlling John McCain. He does exactly what he's told, simply another establishment puppet. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel was simply talking about his concern of the trilateralists, the internationalists, the globalists. This last couple of weeks have been having all sorts of meetings. The whole world financial system is collapsing. We have inflation in the United States, and our inflationary programs are certainly creating massive inflation throughout Asia and partly responsible, in fact largely responsible for the unrest there. When hundreds of thousands of people riot in India, certainly not a word in the controlled media. Massive riots in China, not a word in the controlled media. The average person is much more concerned about Tiger Woods and certainly the upcoming royal wedding than they are the fact that the whole world is on the verge of collapse financially, and war looms increasingly on the horizon. It's only a matter of time before we're involved in a major war, certainly in the Near East and the Middle East, and this may well be a nuclear war. Those of you who have read our January 2008 newsletter will understand that we provided the nuclear weapons, or the know-how to build the nuclear weapons, to Pakistan, and then we gave them the money so they could build the nuclear weapons. And when we found they were still building nuclear weapons in Pakistan, we said, oh shucks, and we were giving the money to do it. Oh, how could we have been so incompetent? Ladies and gentlemen, we've got people in Washington, D.C. who never make a mistake in favor of freedom or our side, because we do have an invisible government. If you haven't read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to get it. If you want to understand how we gave the nuclear weapons and provided the nuclear weapon technology for Pakistan, that's the January 2008 newsletter on Civil Edmonds. Everybody in the entire world knows this story, except the American people, who know so little about what's going on because the media is controlled. You need to read our newsletters. You need to simply read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, and hear my talk on the Forbidden Secret, and read the syllabus, and hear my talk on the Dark Secret, and get the syllabus. You need to hear the DVD or watch the DVD. They sold their souls for rock and roll, the 3-hour, the 4-hour, the 10-hour version. You need to see the DVD on the Trilateral Commission put out by our good friend, a talk that was given by Patrick Wood. You need to get the information that is available through Radio Liberty that you're not going to get into elsewhere, that will explain to you the spiritual nature of the battle and what is really going on behind the scenes. A small group of very wealthy and powerful people control our nation. Indeed, they control the world. But they're energized by powerful spiritual forces, and until you understand that, very little that's going on makes sense. We have a 4-tape set on the financial Armageddon. They're simply poisoning our population. If you doubt that, you need to get our material on aspartame 4-tape set. We have a book on aspartame and these artificial sweeteners. We have 4-tape sets on the fluoride that they're putting in our drinking water, and we actually have 2 4-tape sets on that. We have DVDs on how they're poisoning our population. We have a 4-tape set on aluminum. We have a DVD on aluminum. And of course, they're putting this in so many things. And that's basically one of the most toxic things. It certainly produces Alzheimer's disease. You need, of course, to get our DVD. Mercury Autism, the Global Vaccine Agenda. When you get that, you get a free CD-ROM. We're literally several thousand pages of scientific information on the well-known fact that the mercury in vaccines creates all sorts of complications, poisons the minds of our youth, creates infertility. This is really what it's all about, population control. And people say, if these things were going on, we would know about it. And no, ladies and gentlemen, if these things were going on, you wouldn't know about it. Because what you're talking about, of course, is genocide, organized effort to destroy the American people and to bring about this one world government. If you've never read the National Security Study Memorandum 200, it's available from Radio Liberty, came out 1974 with the name of Henry Kissinger, his signature. What's the major thrust of America?